مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. مع كل الخسائر في الأرواح وما خلفته الحرب العالمية الثانية من دمار، قادت أمريكا العالم لبناء نظام جديد من العلاقات الدولية يحول دون وقوع هذه الكارثة مجددا. وكانت النتيجة مجموعة من الهيئات والمؤسسات الدولية الجديدة: الأمم المتحدة والبنك الدولي والصندوق النقد الدولي وغيرها، تضع القواعد للكل بحيث يتعذر على أي دولة أن تفعل مجددا ما فعلته ألمانيا واليابان. والفكرة الأساسية وراء هذا اسمها الدولية الليبرالية. ولكن هل تمادت هذه الهيئات والمؤسسات؟ هل اكتسبت قدرا أكبر من اللازم من السلطة؟ هل فقدت الدول الفردية قدرا أكبر من اللازم من سيادتها؟ هل ثمة مسار آخر يتحقق به السلام العالمي؟ ربما مسار يمكن أن نسميه الدولية المحافظة. ضيفنا اليوم يؤمن أن النهج المحافظ طريقة أفضل لأمريكا لتقود العالم وتحمي مصالحها أكثر من النهج الليبرالي الذي اتبناه طوال 70 عاما الماضية. ويبدو أن أفكاره وجدت موطنا لها في البيت الأبيض الحالي. لمناقشة فكرة الدولية المحافظة يسرني أن أرحب بالأستاذ المرموق هنري ناو. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Today we're going to talk about both the theory and practice of American foreign policy, and I'm delighted to welcome Professor Henry Nau here with us on our show. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be here.
Now, you have coined a phrase to describe a certain form of foreign policy. You call it conservative internationalism, the title of your recent book. What does that mean? How does it evolve historically?
Well, traditionally we've had kind of three basic ways of thinking about American foreign policy. And by the way, these different ways of thinking about American foreign policy are rooted in our history. So the first way was kind of the first century of our republic, when we basically practiced a nationalist orientation towards the world. Some people call it isolationist, more nationalist. We were a weak country or a small country. We were preoccupied with our domestic problems. And so we were not eager to play a big role on the world stage. Now, we did play a role on the world stage by virtue of what we were doing ideologically, that is, by virtue of building a self-governing republic in a world by the way of monarchies. So we were, others were aware of us, even if we weren't necessarily engaged in the world. The second sort of way in which we have related to the world starts about the end of the 19th century. That's what we call the realist orientation towards world affairs. It's symbolized by Teddy Roosevelt. The idea is that we're now a great power. We became right after the Civil War. We had an enormous expansion of the economy and of the wealth of this country. And so we needed to take our place at the great power table in world affairs and manage sort of the balance of power and get in the game with others. And Teddy Roosevelt symbolized that with dispatching the Great White Fleet. The third way that we thought about it starts with in the 20th century and starts with Woodrow Wilson. And that is that we don't really like that world of balancing power and great power politics. That's the old world. We're the new world. We have a better way of organizing the international system. That's through international institutions. And the whole idea of the League of Nations under Wilson, the United Nations under Franklin Roosevelt emerges. And there the idea is that you try to solve problems together peacefully through negotiations. You try to reduce the role of military power and the whole great power game. In fact, you engage in a lot of disarmament if you can. And you basically pool your military power in order to provide for collective security rather than just national security. Now, all of those three traditions, there is none that says, you know what, we should maybe be thinking about how to improve the world, not just play the great power game. but recognize that you can only do so much through institutions, through centralized institutions. A more conservative way of thinking about the kind of world that you want to create. Conservative internationalist comes along and says, look, we need a world in which there are more free countries, to be honest, because those free countries, in fact, act more peacefully towards one another, and they generate more wealth for their citizens. So we need to pursue a change in the world. We don't want to play the old great power game, but if we're going to do that, we're going to encounter some resistance. We're going to encounter resistance from authoritarian powers, and we're going to have to be ready to play, to some extent, the balance of power game. So conservative internationalism says, look, let's try to make the world a better place, but not through central institutions. We want a conservative world in which countries remain sovereign and independent, but slowly they become more and more republican, with a little r, more and more democratic. And to do that, we are willing to commit our resources, at least selectively, to defend and to expand freedom where we can. So this is a different, it's a combination in some sense of the realist and the liberal internationalist tradition. It runs the risk, by the way, and this is, I'm very much aware of this, it runs the risk that we try to take on too much, because if you're going to try to promote a change in the world and you're willing to back it up with the use of force, you run the risk of getting spread out too far, or getting caught on the slippery slope where you use force and the other side uses force and you get into an escalation of force. And so there are elements of priority and selectivity that I mentioned, and also elements of compromise that characterize this approach. So it says we ought to care about freedom where it counts the most. And for example, today, in the world as it is after the Second World War, freedom counts the most really on the borders of the major frontiers of freedom in Europe and in Asia. That's where the democratic powers exist. All of the countries of Europe were democratic and open. And now in Asia we have Japan, South Korea, of course other countries like India, New Zealand, Australia, powerful democracies. So on the borders of those frontiers, I argue we need to focus. Today that's the Korean problem and the problem in Ukraine. In other parts of the world we have interests. In the Middle East, for example, and in Southwest Asia and other parts of the world, we have interests, but we should defend those interests, and we should defend our friends in those regions, but we should be a little more modest, I think, about trying to spread republicanism, at least an American-style republicanism built on division of powers and federalism and all the other elements that characterize our system.
Let's try to disentangle some of what you just said.
Right.
Now, is there really a distinction between the post-World War II effort to create institutions, United Nations, World Bank and International Monetary Fund, and the more conservative focus you mentioned to expand democracy and defend our friends and allies?
Yeah.
Is there a distinction here, or is,
well,
is it a distinction of proportion, not of substance?
Yeah, it is a distinction of degree, not of kind. But two of the chapters in my book deal with Truman and Reagan. And in the case of Truman, there's a big debate about whether Truman would have stuck with the UN. I should put it the other way, that is, whether Roosevelt would have stuck with the UN regardless of the problems in dealing with the Soviet Union. The assumption is that he probably would have. He wanted to deal with Uncle Joe and try to make the world work in cooperation. Joseph Stalin. Make the world work in cooperation with the Soviet Union. Truman came along and had a little bit of a different sense, a more conservative internationalist sense. He recognized that what we were engaged in was not just a balance of power conflict with the Soviet Union, but we were in fact representing two very different ways of life. He outlined that in his so-called Truman Doctrine. He said, look, we're defending freedom on one side of this divide, and they're defending authoritarianism on the other side. And we need to conceive of this conflict more in ideological terms, and more in terms of the need to defend and ultimately to spread democracy. And to do that, I think, now, Truman was still a devotee of Roosevelt and of the liberal internationalist tradition, so he still had in mind to try to work with the United Nations. He did, in the case of the Korean War, for example, believe that we should make the United Nations work in that context. So he was caught in between kind of the realization that, look, we're not going to be able to negotiate effectively with authoritarian countries, certainly not to promote freedom inside these institutions. We're going to have to work more for allies and through democratic communities in order to achieve our objectives. But on the other hand, maybe the long-term goal is to try to ultimately empower the United Nations. Now, Ronald Reagan becomes a president who departs from that second element and says, look, we don't need a world in which we have strong centralized institutions. They are really not accountable to the people, that is the United Nations. It's accountable to governments, but there's no one in the United Nations that is elected by the people. We want societies in which the leaders are elected by the people, so we want countries to retain their national sovereignty and be responsible for their own national defense, but nevertheless live side by side with one another in peace and resolving their conflicts without resort to military threat. Now that's the democratic peace, which we know exists, by the way, from a lot of studies. We know that democracies do not, in fact, get into conflicts with one another, and they do not resort to military threats in those conflicts. So this is the vision of a world not quite like Wilson's world, or we wouldn't have centralized institution. It's more like what Thomas Jefferson envisioned, namely a world of sister republics. When he was queried about what was going to happen in the Louisiana territory that we had just acquired from France, he said, well, look, I expect that there are going to be groups emerge that will be sister republics, sister groups. They'll speak the same language, they'll have the same culture, they'll be interested in self-government, but they don't necessarily have to join the United States. We don't have to have a central government. They can be separate if they wish, or they can be united if that's better. Now that was a very different vision of the world than Woodrow Wilson came along with, who had a very strong sense of executive power, both in domestic politics and in international politics. And it's more of the conservative view of the kind of world we're aiming for. We want a world at peace, but we want a world in which countries remain separate, sovereign, have the right to their own national defense. It's kind of a Second Amendment right for all countries in the international system.
So where would you place in this spectrum between liberal internationalism and conservative internationalism, where would you place Donald Trump and America First?
Well, Donald Trump is a bit of I was going to say a throwback, but his approach has not been visible for a while in our system. Hasn't been visible since immediately after World War II, when we still had a nationalist, or you could say isolationist element in Congress, led by Robert Taft, also to some extent by Vandenberg, though Vandenberg was eventually another senator at the time, who was eventually persuaded by Truman that we needed to be more active in the world. But the nationalist perspective says, look, we should take care of ourselves, and we should expect other countries to take care of themselves. After all, they care about their country more than we do, so why wouldn't they defend themselves? So if we took this attitude that everybody defends first their own country, and then we cooperate where we can, and we manage our conflicts where we can't, that would make for a better world than one in which we go out trying to tell people what to do, trying to tell people to be democracies, or play this cynical game of great power politics that eventually results in some kind of military confrontation.
Okay, when we come back, we'll discuss more with Professor Henry Now about the state of American foreign policy and where it's headed in just a moment. Our guest again today is Professor Henry Now. For more than 40 years, Professor Now has traveled between the worlds of academia and policymaking as one of the leading scholar practitioners of American foreign policy. After serving in the State Department in the 1970s, he served as the senior staff member responsible for international economic affairs in President Ronald Reagan's National Security Council. Then, as professor of political science and international relations at George Washington University, he has played a key role interpreting the critical role of what he calls conservative internationalism in American foreign policy. The author of 7 books on American history, foreign policy, and world affairs, this former lieutenant in the 82nd Airborne Division received his undergraduate degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and his master's and doctoral degrees from Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies here in Washington. So you have a background that includes a focus on international economic affairs. I'd like to ask you about trade. President Trump has made a very big issue about trade, the unfairness of trade agreements. What's the right role for agreements and nationalism and internationalism in American trade policy?
Well, on trade, I think Trump reveals his nationalist instincts more than almost any other issue. And he clearly has adopted what appears to be a protectionist attitude. Now, he hasn't unwound yet existing agreements. He's rejected new agreements like the TPP, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership in Asia. And he is invested now in renegotiating a number of our trade agreements with the European Union, with the North American Free Trade Agreement, with Mexico and Canada. I am hopeful that, and I believe he does understand the importance of the world economy, and especially to the kind of foreign policy that America has had, almost since its origins. I mean, we have had this idea that there is a better way to organize the world than in terms of military camps and military competition. That we should, in fact, facilitate trade, because countries can all become better off through trade. They don't get involved in these zero-sum conflicts where one gains a piece of territory and the other loses that piece of territory. Thomas Jefferson had this view from the very beginning, and he sent our Navy as far away as the Mediterranean, quite a ways away in those days, in order to defend our trade. So trade has been extremely important since World War II. And it has reflected something unusual about American nationalism. American nationalism has said that, look, we're not against other countries becoming strong and having their own nationalisms. In fact, we want them to become wealthy. And so America has been engaged in a policy for now almost 75 years of opening up our market and world markets to countries that were formerly our adversaries, some that may still be our adversaries, like China, in the interest of helping them become wealthy, and on the assumption that they will then be more satisfied and that they will be possibly even intrigued and attracted to some of the principles of democracy and law that underwrite the whole notion of free trade. So it's that's an unusual kind of nationalism. In the past, the European powers, for example, practiced a mercantilist trade policy under colonialism, where they wanted to export always more to other countries than they imported. Well, America has been very generous in opening up its import markets. And we've done that again the last 20 years with China. I think there's a little bit of a blowback now because China has become so much more prominent in our import market. It was about 4% in the mid-90s. It's now about 20%. But this is not uncommon. We've done this with practically every other country that has developed after World War II. And I think the jury is still out to some extent on whether or not the experiment with China has worked or not. So it's very important for us to keep that world economy open. The key to that, by the way, is our own domestic economy. Here I think Trump is focused on trying to get the American economy moving at a somewhat accelerated, more accelerated rate than it has in the past. And if that happens, then I think we become less concerned about imports. That helps us a great deal on trade. By the way, it also helps us a great deal on immigration, because we're creating the jobs that people want and need.
So let me shift gears for a moment. Reading between the lines of your remarks about American priorities around the world, I get the sense that the Middle East should be a little bit lower on our priority level than it has been for the last couple of decades. Is that in fact your view compared to, say, East Asia and Europe? And how would that translate into real policy?
Yeah, I think relatively speaking, yes. But by the way, I'm not sure that I'm putting less emphasis on the Middle East than President Obama did. President Obama was very, very hesitant about the Middle East. You know, he once famously said, or one of his advisors said, that look, we intervened in Iraq and occupied Iraq and it became a mess. We intervened in Libya but didn't occupy Libya and it became a mess. We didn't intervene or occupy Syria and it became a mess. Maybe we should just stay out of this region. We're committed to the region, and conservative internationalism believes that, in other words, you support the freedom that exists in these less in these lower priority regions like the Middle East and Southwest Asia. So you certainly support your ally and friend Israel. And you work to push other countries incrementally in that direction. But your principal concern is peace in the region and threats to our national interests like terrorism. It is true that over time oil is becoming less important, and that was a major focus of our interest in the Middle East. But I think that's going to be replaced by the commitment we have to Israel and by the objective we have of a Palestinian-Israeli peace agreement at some point in the future that would provide an acceptable solution and ultimately a territorial agreement and settlement that would become the basis for now maybe economic revival of this region. So there's a lot of prospect for development in the region. But I think at the moment I would not want to see us get too heavily involved in the Middle East like maybe we were in the case of Iraq when we have a serious problem like Korea, where much more is at stake for the future of our country and for the future of freedom.
You have seen the system from the inside out, and you study it from the outside in. Does it work, our foreign policy system? And if there's something about it that you would fix, what would that be?
Well, I think it works if you have a little bit of historical perspective. In 1780s, 1790s, this country was building something, or started to build something that had never been done before. That is the idea that a large country could be based on self-government, on trusting the people, an increasing number of people, initially very small, but nevertheless, more than in any other country. We gave the franchise to vote, even when these people couldn't write their names, because we believed in the concept of self-government. We expanded that franchise over the next 2 centuries. Today, almost everybody in America, including to some extent illegal immigrants, can vote. We have perfected a model that is based upon trust in the people and checks and balances. Now, we have a divided country as a result. We did from the very beginning. We had big battles between the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians in the 1790s. It's a characteristic of republicanism because the only check on power, if you don't want it to become a monarchy, is in fact opposition. So we have, I think, healthy competition today in America. We have a Republican Party which is competitive. It wasn't competitive, by the way, at least in the Congress, for 60 years. From 33 to 95, the Republicans controlled the House for only 4 years and the Senate for only 8 years. So we now have a competitive system. I think that's added a bit to the appearance of conflict and partisanship, but really it's no worse than I think it ought to be in some sense. Now, I think we need a civil public square where we debate these issues and where the media helps us to bring these issues on a reasonably fair basis to the people. But then we trust the people. And when the people, elected Donald Trump, we go with the people. At least that's my view of what it means to be Republican. If you don't like it, you work hard to change it at the next election, which is also very important. Thomas Jefferson once said, he said, if you find yourself in a minority in a republic, he says, you really have only one choice. He says, you can't secede. You can't impose your view on the majority. You have to go back to the public square and win the majority. And then you're playing the game by the rules of a republic. So we still have a great republic in this country, which was built without a monarchy, was built without a church, a state church. Those were the things that held countries together 200 years ago. And I think, underneath it all, I think America is very solid and is going to move ahead in the future.
Professor Henry Now, thank you so much for joining us in Dakhel, Washington.
Thanks a lot, Rob. Appreciate it.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول دور الأمم المتحدة في حل المشكلات الدولية اليوم، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.